Thank you very much, Richard. Yeah, Richard and Helen asked me if I can just talk about health and well-being in the workplace. It's become a very, very big issue. So let me give you a little bit of history on why it is and the bottom line of why it's become really big time, particularly in the big corporates, the big public sector bodies, and so on. I think this all started with do you remember the good old financial crisis? We seem to have had from 2008 till now, one bloody crisis after another. But anyway, in 2008 till about 2012, 15, we had the financial crisis. And a lot of people lost their job, particularly in the finance sector and lots of sectors, 30, 40% of people in the finance sector lost their job. And then what happened was organizations were saying things like, well, we're so mean and lean during that period of time. How do we retain people? How do we keep them? How do we retain them and attract new cohort of people? And they started to say, we got to change the culture. We got to treat people better. And then the stress-related ill health started to become big time. So today, for example, the health and safety executive have calculated last year that 57% of all long-term sickness absence was due to stress, anxiety, and depression. And only 25% to what used to be the main cause of sickness absence in the UK economy, which is musculoskeletal, backache and all that stuff. That's no longer the big one. But it's not just in the UK, by the way, it's in every developed country now. Stress, anxiety, and depression, what we call the common mental disorders, are the real big cost of, and you know how the government is now saying we have to get people back into work, and if they're off ill, we got to get them back into work. Do you know that if you look at the people who are getting, government support for being off work, 40% of them are again for stress at work. That's the bit, mental health, depression, and anxiety, basically. So we've got issues, and it started in the financial crisis. And then we lead up to the time that we then had in between, and we're recovering from the financial crisis. Of course, we then got hit by the pandemic. And the pandemic, in a way, was good from my perspective because it accelerated a trend that we needed to reduce the stress-related ill health, to get higher productivity. Remember, our productivity is piss poor, absolutely rock bottom. We're at the bottom of the G7 on productivity per capita. We're 17th in the G20 on productivity per capita. And we'll talk a bit about why that is. And by the way, it's a part of the kind of well-being thing. So then the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden, things that people wanted where they could get it, i.e. working more flexibly, or what we're now calling the hybrid workforce, is now every day, isn't it? Most companies, most organizations people come in 2 or 3 days a week, and that's it. Right? We have more work-life integration. That's a good thing because people have wanted that. The decade before, we saw the massive number of people who didn't have to be at the coalface. Obviously, if you're a bus driver, if you're a nurse, a doctor, a paste assembly line worker, you got to be there at the workplace. But we're a service-based economy, and service-based economies can, given the technology, can work much more flexibly. So we need to change. And the good news is I think the pandemic made us think, hey, look at the things we're seeing in the news. Number one, hybrid working is now here. We're talking about the 4-day working week. We're talking about health of employees. We're talking about productivity. These are all the things the UK economy needs, right? And to be more effective. And the other driver, I think, for all of this, aside from the high stress-related sickness absence figures that we have, which are massive, aside from that, and aside from our kind of productivity kind of issues, is the millennials. The young millennials and the Z generation won't tolerate what their parents tolerated, which was crap work, not good work, bad work. Organization, because they had mortgages. Look at the Z generation, young millennials can't afford a bloody mortgage, let alone, but their parents tolerated bad work because they had mortgages to pay and everything else. That generation won't. So if you want to attract the younger workers and the younger people, which we do in the Northwest, want more of them to stay here. We have the biggest collection of university students in Europe. Do you know we have the biggest Manchester University is now the biggest university in the whole of Europe in terms of scale, 42,000 students. We have MMU, the second biggest university in Europe, and we have Salford. We have 3 universities with 120,000 students, right? How do we retain these people in the Northwest? How do we get, that's the next generation. And so from my point of view, that's another movement toward a well-being culture. Now, what does well-being mean when I talk about it? Well-being is not beanbags, ping pong tables, sushi at your desk, and mindfulness at lunch. It is not that, right? I mean, I like a well-being day where I can have my smoothies and my Indian head massage. We all like that stuff, but that's not what well-being is. That's low-hanging fruit stuff. That's fun things. Nothing wrong with any of those, but that's not what well-being is. What well-being really is, have you created in your organization, and remember, probably most of you on now are either public sector or your SME, your small and medium-sized enterprise, right? How do you create the right kind of culture where people feel valued, trusted, engaged, really enjoy their job, coming to work? How do you do that? If you do that, you'll retain them and you'll attract other ones to come in, the next generation. And so well-being is really much more strategic. It's much more about, for example, the big issues. I run something called the National Forum for Health and Wellbeing at Work. It's made up of 44 global employers. What happened is about 6 years ago, a group of chief medical officers and HR directors came to Manchester Business School and said, Cary, we're very concerned about retaining them and attracting the next generation of people and being more productive because the country's productivity is so crap. So can you form a national forum for health and well-being? We didn't need any money. This is all volunteers. And who are these people? HR directors, chief medical officers, BT, BP, Shell, GSK, Rolls-Royce, the BBC. They all came. We now have 45 global employers, all right? And very senior people. We meet regularly, like about every 6 weeks. Nobody funds it. It's a volunteer organization, but we do things about how we're going to create the right kind of culture. And by the way, we're very worried about the SME sector. They don't have the HR departments. They don't have the chief medical, they don't have the occupational health. What are we going to do? How are we going to help them? How are we going to help? What are we going to do? And how are we going to make this a much more strategic issue so that we change the culture so that Britain is more effective, more productive, and particularly with the B word. Obviously, I don't care, but I'm going to say it. The biggest single mistake this country has ever made was Brexit. We all know it. 75% of the population now know it because we're getting all the public opinion polls are going in the same direction. And we're sticking with something that's actually bad for us in terms of retaining skills, retaining people, free movement, and so on. But anyway, let's not get political. Let me just stick with my well-being thing. So we have all these challenges. We have the cost of living crisis. We have financial well-being worries by employees. We have people worried about their jobs as we're entering a recession, right? How are we going to retain people? How are we going to get the most out of the people we have? And that's what well-being is about. And it needs to be much more strategic. And what do I mean by strategic? That means we have to find out from employees how they perceive their organization and how it can be improved. In other words, how do we engage our employees? And the good news, I think, from the SME sector is this: you're closer to the people than the big businesses are. You're closer to the people that actually produce the goodies, right? So how do we get them involved and get from them what they need, what would help them ensure that they have, better work-life balance? Can they work more flexibly? What are they looking for in life, and how can we enable that so our productivity increases and then we don't burn them out? It's basically about that. How do we create a much more resilient workforce? Some of the big key issues that my national forum has come up with, which applies to the big companies, the big public sector bodies, but also applies to the SME sector, is the big issues they have. Number one, financial well-being. What do we do to help our employees out? In this particular circumstance, cost of living crisis, a recession about to hit, cost of energy, all of that stuff, right? So what do we do to help them with that? Number two, what do we do about our managers, our line managers? So when we met 6 years ago, our first meeting that we met with the National Forum, I said, if there was one thing you can do, guys and gals, HR directors, chief medical officers, directors of health and well-being, what would you do? What is really causing the big problems? You know what they said? Quote, crap management. In other words, what we do is we promote and recruit managers based on their technical skills, not their people skills. And what these people were saying is the problem we have is we don't have many managers who have good social skills. Good, what in my trade we call EQ, emotional intelligence. And we need more of those. And by the way, that is a big conundrum when it comes to productivity. We have technically extremely good managers from shop floor to top floor, and our business schools produce them, and our universities produce them at undergraduate levels and a whole range of things. But you know what? It's about managing human beings. What is productivity? Productivity is what Cary Cooper produces in an hour or a day. I'm a worker, right? To some extent, what I produce is a consequence of how I'm managed. If I feel valued and trusted and am recognized when I achieve good things, guess what? I'm going to produce more. So the National Forum, even the government's thinking about this now, finally, that how do we ensure that what we do in the future is we recruit and promote people to these roles, to managerial roles, from shop floor all the way up to top floor, where people have parity between their people skills and their technical skills. But if you think about life, we tend to promote them based on their technical skills. And here's a pyramid. We have pyramids. All your organizations have pyramids, whether in the public sector or the private sector. That means if a teacher wants to get ahead, wants to gain status, wants more money, what does a teacher have to do? The teacher has to go to become a head teacher, right? A department head, then a head teacher, right? A marketing manager, a marketeer will have to be a marketing manager, right? And so they may feel they have to do that, but actually they're not particularly good at it, right? They don't necessarily want to be a manager, but that's the only way they can actually get advance. In other words, we don't have we have a pyramidal system. You go to the top, it gets narrower and narrower. We don't have a box where a good engineer can get paid as much as a CEO just by staying as a great engineer. We have a weird system. The only way to get ahead is to go up, but you may be great as an engineer and crap as a manager, or you don't even want to do that, but that gets you more money, more status, etc. So we have an issue, but I do think in the future, what we have to do is when we recruit or promote people, we have to ensure there's parity between their people skills and their technical skills. That's vital, right? And most of the companies involved in my national forum are really considering that now. It's not just we're going to hire that guy because he's a great engineer, but we're hiring him for a management role. No, we're going to find out whether he actually can manage people by looking at his past performance, by doing assessment centers which look at his personality, his or her personality. So that's one of the big picture issues I think that's going to be really important in the future. And I think the flexible working is another one. People have wanted that for a long time. The good news, I think we're moving in the right direction on that. And any employer that says you have to be at the coalface, like Goldman Sachs did with its chief executive of Goldman Sachs. Do you remember that? David Solomon said, I'm sorry, you have to be in Monday to Friday, 60-hour weeks. That's what it is. No. You know what my students say about that? I'm not going to go work for them. You damage the brand, totally damage brand. You damage brands when you do things like that. You have to look at the next generation, what they're looking for. I know the millennials are called snowflakes, but you know what? In a way, I agree with the snowflakes. They want good work. They're prepared to work long hours, the young kids. I see them at university. I see them doing their MBAs or just as undergraduates. They want to work hard, but they want to have a good quality of working life. They want to be valued, trusted, given challenges, get training, all that kind of stuff, right? And they want that, but they don't want command and control. They don't want to. They won't go to an iconic brand to put on their CV any longer and work there for 2 years and then are spit out. No, they won't do that anymore. They don't even want to go to those organizations anymore. And so we have a different, and it's great because the pandemic's changed things. But how do we be kind to people? How do we recognize them when they do a good job? Can you think of people that have mentored you in your career somewhere along the line? There were people who were looking after your backside. They cared about you. And we need more of that. And we need more of that from our managerial pool of people from shop floor to top floor. So really interesting times. We're talking about the 4-day working week, the study that was just done, 61 companies involved. 98% of them said this was great, was delivering to the bottom line. We already had research, by the way, in Sweden, Iceland, New Zealand, a number of countries where the 4-day working week was working. I don't know if we need a 4-day working week. All I know is we need more flexibility. And if you can get your job done in 3 or 4 days a week, great. Come on. If you can achieve your objectives, fantastic. But we need that trusting of people and the rest of it. And I think, we have a good opportunity in the UK now. I mean, the thing actually, in my view, holding us partly back, which I think will in the next few years leave. And we can already see it with the first thing with Northern Ireland. Brexit is a problem. It really is, in terms of the skills we need, in terms of our biggest market. But you know what? We can overcome that. We can overcome it. We're getting back or closer to Europe. We need to do that because it's a big market for us. But we also can do our own thing. Forget the Brexit for the time being. We can do our own thing by, the SMEs can drive us, by the way. Our SMEs are brilliant. The Northwest is fantastic. We have some of the great companies, and we don't need big companies very much anymore. They're getting smaller, and the SMEs are much more agile and flexible. But I think they have to take into account the people they manage, and that's what strategic looks like. I don't know if you know this, on the board of every health authority in the country, the NHS did this last year. They now have a non-executive director whose role is exclusively health and well-being of employees. And that's now what the private sector is thinking of. Shouldn't we have a non-executive director on the board of all companies and public sector bodies whose job it is to look after the employees? Because the evidence shows if you look after them, it'll deliver to the bottom line. You'll have less sickness absence days, and you'll have higher productivity. The evidence is mounting big time on that. I've done 2 books on it. One, I've reviewed all the evidence on the link between well-being and productivity output. Because if it doesn't, then you guys are not going to want to do it because your businesses depend on hitting the bottom line. So in the end, how you treat, the old euphemism you used to hear, and the euphemism was, the most valuable resource we have is our human resource. Well, let's finally action that. If you really believe it, let's do something about it. And we can, certainly in the Northwest, do a lot because we're an SME capital. And SMEs are driving the change, and they can drive this change. So I think it's great. And well-being, let me just finish off, and then I'll open it up for chatting with all of you guys. You'll be interested to hear this. Do you remember there was a guy called Bobby Kennedy, John Kennedy's brother, the greatest president the United States never had? Okay. Unfortunately, got assassinated in my hometown of LA. Right. I've been in England 50 years now, but I came as a student. But listen to this. Bobby Kennedy, 2 weeks before he died, he was giving a talk at the University of Kansas. He was trying to get the Democratic nomination for president of the United States. So he was touring the country, right, to get the nomination. Guess what his speech was about? So well-being is not a new construct. His speech was, we don't need gross national product, GDP. In those days, they called it gross national product. Everything we produce adds up, right? It's our GDP. We don't need that. We need gross national well-being. This is what he said in his night. That was the title of his speech. Forget GNP. Let's do GWP, gross national product, gross national well-being. So listen what he said. I'm not going to do the whole speech, but this is a brilliant speech, probably the best ever. He said, too much and for too long, we seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product now is $800 billion a year. But that gross national product, if we judge the United States of America by that gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette production, and it does. And it counts ambulances to clear our highways of the carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. Because that's everything we produce, right? Even the construction of a jail is a part of your GDP, all right? It counts the destruction of the redwood and the loss of the natural wonder in the chaotic sprawl of our cities. Remember, this was Vietnam, 1968. It counts the production of napalm bombs that we drop in Vietnam, and counts nuclear warheads, still counts it today, and armored cars for police to fight the riots on our street. Yet the gross national product, or GDP as we call it now, does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, or the intelligence of our public debate or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. Powerful speech. But he was talking gross national well-being. Do you know there are countries that now have it? New Zealand has it. It started with Bhutan. They were the first country to measure gross national well-being. GDP is only one component of that. It's quite interesting. And there's a move in that direction by countries to actually annually look at their gross national well-being, of which GDP is a part, just to see where they're going as a country. But as a business workplace, if we want to get ahead, and given Brexit, we're being forced to do much more than many other countries are doing to get out of this, the economic decline that we're seeing in many countries, or the recession we're about to see. So I think this is a bottom line issue for me, how we treat people at work. So I'll kind of leave it at that.